Management in Canada, the competitive challenges. Chapter 1. After this chapter, you should be able to define the terms management, competitiveness, and quality, explain why a competitive focus has become imperative in a globalizing world, identify the traditional functions and purposes of management, explain the types of skills that managers need to achieve their goals, discuss the major theories of management and their relevance to management today, contrast management in a small business with that in a large corporation, and discuss why it is important for management students, tomorrow's managers, to develop their own personal theories of management. Managing the future. What does it mean to manage the future? It means paying attention to the past, to the present, and to patterns of change in the world around us. In managing the future, understanding and initiating action are top priorities. For any organization, constant innovation and improvement are essential. Relying solely on the past is neither possible nor is it good management. Using a past orientation results in missed opportunities and a failure to keep up with changes in today's emphasis on the customer. The past-oriented managers wants to attract and retain customers, but focuses primarily on other parts of the organization, such as the accounting system, environmental and tax laws, and the sources and flow of funding. All of these are important, but they are only means to the end rather than the end in themselves. McDonald's Corporation is one future-oriented company that respects and has learned from the past, but knows that the past can't be repeated. In the notoriously competitive fast food business, McDonald's has managed to grow from its founding in 1955 to a massive worldwide organization that has more than 15,000 franchises and wholly owned outlets spread among many different countries and employing more than 183 staff members. And I'm sure that number is a lot bigger now. Behind the well-known golden arches is an innovative management, continually watching consumer trends and searching for ways to remain competitive. When McDonald's was planning its first outlet in Moscow, managers discovered that the potatoes grown in Russia did not meet their specifications for fiber and water content. A management decision was made to enlist a number of Russian potato growers to provide them with new varieties of potatoes and to guarantee them a market for their product. McDonald's innovations in Canada include the Big Mac, the Egg McMuffin, Chicken McNuggets, salads, and the McChicken sandwich. The McDLT was first offered in 1985, but was not widely accepted. In the early 1990s, it was replaced with the McLean, a low-fat burger, which McDonald's launched with a $50 million advertising campaign. This product did not catch on either and was dropped in early 1996. In May 1996, after extensive test marketing and what is reported to have been a $200 million advertising campaign, McDonald's launched the Arch Deluxe, a premium hamburger designed to attract more adults to supplement McDonald's already successful hold on the children's market. This innovation was only moderately successful and was followed by the introduction of pizza to attract teenagers and young adults. Then, in 1998, to stay abreast of food fashions, McDonald's introduced the McWrap. This brief synopsis illustrates the McDonald's approach to try innovations, continue with them if they succeed, and drop them if they do not. It recognizes that innovation is likely to result in some mistakes, but that the biggest mistake is not to innovate at all. While McDonald's founder, Ray Kroc, got his ideas for fast and efficient service from the original McDonald's brothers, he quickly expanded on the theme and began to offer franchises in what for 1955 was almost a completely new concept of food sales. In effect, he used the past, in brackets, the McDonald brothers emphasis on fast and pleasant service, as well as the present and a look to the future to manage his and McDonald's future. We can't all be Ray Krocs. And we might, anyway, but we can prepare ourselves to be successful managers by learning from the successes and failures of those who have gone before us. And of course, having seen some of the movies that have came out about how McDonald's started, some of us may or may not want to become these people, but anyway. Management and managers in Canada. Before embarking on the study of management, it is reasonable to ask what management is and why it exists. Practitioners and scholars have suggested any number of definitions, the flavor of which has changed over the years. In a simple form, we can look backwards nearly a century to Henry Ford, the founder of Ford Motor Company and the inventor of mass production. He has been quoted as having said that management consists of causing average men to do the work of superior men. While there is an element of truth in this statement, and obviously some gaps from a gender representation perspective, the basic concepts underlying it are as inappropriate today as the gender-specific language in which he expressed himself. See, the author didn't like that quote either. No longer is the manager's sole purpose to extract more production from workers, although it can feel that way in some environments. True, no organization can function effectively for long if it permits inefficiencies to continue, but the scope of management today is much broader than it was in Ford's time. And before starting the next section, we'll give you a definition. Planning. The function of management that determines the objectives of the business and how best to achieve those objectives. Managers and management. In general, a manager is someone who directs and oversees the work and performance of other individuals. Even in a one-person company, however, success depends on other management skills that in many ways are analogous to those required in the largest of global corporations. In the simplest terms, today is generally recognized that management responsibilities can be categorized into four fundamental functions: planning, organizing, leading, and controlling. This book will treat each of these functions separately and in some detail. So I've given you the definition of planning, and before we go forward, I'll read you the other three definitions. Organizing, the function of management that arranges appropriate staffing and assigns responsibilities and tasks to individuals and groups in order to best achieve the objectives established by planning. Leading, the function of management concerned with demonstrating by example and by teaching, directing, and motivating employees to perform effectively to achieve the objectives of the organization. Controlling, the function of management that involves monitoring performance, comparing results with planned objectives, and providing feedback and, if necessary, correction. So I think a lot of managers, and this is not part of the book, I think a lot of managers feel that if they're not giving feedback, they're not being a good manager. But the challenge with that is that sometimes the person's actually doing a really good job. And so just don't feel the need to critique something that's actually good. You know, you're still being a good manager, even if you don't have feedback when someone's doing a good job. And in fact, in my opinion, that's exactly the time to come out with your coaching and kind of cheerleading skills, because that's where, as a manager, you can really build a great environment for your team to thrive. Yeah, so I'll keep going. Planning determines what results the company wishes to achieve and how those results may be achieved. Organizing establishes and operates the structures, policies, and procedures through which the results will be achieved. Leading consists of motivating and providing examples to encourage people to work harmoniously and effectively toward the desired end goals. I'm going to read that one again. Leading consists of motivating and providing examples to encourage people to work harmoniously and effectively towards the desired end goal. I think that's really important. Controlling includes establishing the frameworks within which tasks will be done, monitoring the performance of those tasks, and providing feedback and corrective action to maximize efficiency and effectiveness. These functions in combination constitute the acts of management, and the people who perform them are managers. In a large organization, these 4 functions may be distributed among a number of divisions or departments. In the smallest business, a one-person entrepreneurship, the owner-manager must perform all of the functions. Yet, the scope of the functions and how they can be performed are fundamentally the same, regardless of the size of the organization or whether it is a business organized for profit, a not-for-profit organization, or a governmental department, division, or agency. Give you a minute to. The management challenge in Canada. Although some management principles are almost universal, each economy and society has its own distinct features that require adaptations in the actual practice of management. As will be discussed in Chapter 14, cultural differences from country to country have a profound impact on which management approaches and techniques will be effective in a particular location. It is important, then, to consider the unique features of Canada that have an influence on Canadian management. First, as is well known but often disregarded, individual and family incomes in Canada far exceed those in most of the rest of the world. I'm going to have to fact check that later and see if that's still true. As a result, Canada maintains a high level of literacy and specialized education, an enviable standard of healthcare with its resulting long life expectancy, and relative freedom from political unrest and upheavals. In some respects, these factors assist Canadian managers, but at the same time, they offer challenges because, unlike the situation in some societies, employees expect and demand a higher degree of participation in management decisions than would have been thought possible even a few years ago. Geography also plays a significant role in Canadian management. Canada's population is one of the smallest among industrialized nations. At some 30 million people, it is roughly equal to the population of California. Moreover, most of Canada's relatively small population is spread in a band only 100 kilometers wide and some 6,000 kilometers long. Because of Canada's wide distribution of population and industrial activity, Canadian managers must plan well ahead because they cannot always count on quick delivery of needed products, as would be the case for many managers in the United States and in Europe, whose sources of supply are often within an overnight truck haul. Canadian managers also must tailor their thinking to the fact that most Canadians live and work within only 2 or 3 hours drive from the United States. This means that Canadian consumers have relatively easy access to the products produced and marketed in in the much larger economy of the United States. This proximity creates significant competitive pressures. It also means that because of the size of the economy in the United States, Canadian managers have to be alert to changes in that country as well as in our own. From its earliest days, Canada has been heavily dependent on resource-based industries, from the early dependence on fish and furs, through the provision of masts and spars to the British Navy, and the subsequent forest products industries, to the growth of the industries based on mineral, agricultural, and fisheries products. As recently as 1970, 42.8% of Canada's exports were classified as food and agricultural products and ores and metals. Even though that proportion dropped by almost half to 23.5% in the following quarter century, the total output is even greater than it was in the earlier date. As a result of this emphasis on these industries, Canadian managers have had to cope with the resource industry's typical boom and bust cycles, and have often had to operate in remote and relatively inaccessible locations. Still, another complicating factor is Canada's heavy dependence on foreign trade. As will be discussed in Chapter 14, this dependence has profound implications for Canadian managers, even if their markets are solely within Canada and they do not directly import or export products. These and other factors contribute to the challenges facing Canadian managers. All must be recognized and accounted for if Canadian organizations are to be competitive in the world market as well as in the domestic market. Next section, competitiveness. And the definition is the capacity of an organization in a free and fair market to produce goods and services that meet the needs and wishes of customers without causing environmental degradation while simultaneously maintaining or expanding the real incomes of its employees and owners. It is the ultimate measure of potential for effective operations. So let's start the section. Competitiveness. An enterprise, whether a business or a not-for-profit, whether large or small, must be competitive to stay alive. To be competitive, an organization must offer its products or services in ways that are better, less expensive, or more readily available than those of its competitors. Those organizations that do not remain competitive soon lose the sale or other forms of support on which they depend in order to meet their payrolls and pay their other expenses. When they fail, their employees lose their jobs. In addition, shareholders or other owners lose the money they have invested. As a consequence, they do not want to, or they are unable to, invest more money in other business enterprises that could otherwise be the sources of Canadian job opportunities. One aspect of competitiveness is how much an organization decides to invest in enhancement of quality, thus driving up the selling price of products and services and inhibiting potential purchasers or users of the service. Managers must decide on the optimum balance between higher quality and quicker service on the one hand, and lower selling price on the other. These decisions are almost daily challenges for managers as customer expectations increase due to improved product and services that become available from competitors. For example, the computing power of a small notebook computer is many times that of room-sized computers that were the state of the art only 20 or 30 years ago. That would be a bit longer ago now. No computer manufacturer could remain in business today if its products were only as good as those that were state of the art a few years ago, or perhaps even a few months ago. Similar improvements in other industries, while perhaps not quite as dramatic, still pose challenges to managers not to be left behind in quality enhancements. Management for efficiency. One of the most easily recognized responsibilities of the manager is to promote efficiency. This term means to obtain desired results with the least expenditure of money, effort, and time. A single-minded concentration on cost cutting can often increase efficiency substantially. There remains, however, a challenge to management to know which cost-cutting method is desirable and which would lead to savings in the short term, but ultimately would lead to inefficiency, erosion of quality, and other unanticipated problems. Another challenge to management is that any move towards efficiency entails change. If change is not managed skillfully, it may be delayed or even prevented by subtle and not so subtle opposition on the part of those affected. The management of change will be considered further in Chapter 9. For now, it is sufficient to point out that improvements in efficiency are often more difficult to achieve than might seem likely on first thought, and in some circumstances may even prove to be counterproductive. This has definitely been something I ran into in the workplace. There's a lot of pressure to find an efficiency, demonstrate you found it, prove how much time it saved, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But there really, in my experience, wasn't a lot of focus on what the consequences might be, short-term or long-term. It was all about how much money can we save now, or how many more of a particular project can we finish sooner. And I think those are the types of things that really, hopefully, if you become a manager someday, that you keep in mind that that efficiency is of course important, but you want to understand the impact it's going to have on the people that you work with, on the product or service. I think there's an integrity component to efficiency that sometimes is lost. That's just my opinion, not in the book. Management for effectiveness. Efficiency addresses whether a task or a program is being conducted in the optimum and least costly manner. A more difficult question is whether it is being conducted in such a way as to assure effectiveness. It kind of ties into what I was saying. Whereas efficiency addresses the question of how something is being done. Effectiveness asks, why is it being done? Even if something is being done in absolutely the most efficient manner, it still may be contributing little or nothing to the purpose of the organization. With the advent of computers and the ease with which numbers can be crunched and reports can be generated, many managers are deluged with statistical reports, all impressive, all correct, and many absolutely useless. Definitely ran into this. Massive figure-laden reports, while useful tools, are never a substitute for management skill and management thinking. A good test is whether a given report actually leads to a decision being made. And being made, what it doesn't say here is, and being made accurately. So you might make tons of decisions off of massive amounts of data because you think you're understanding it properly and because you're trusting the math behind it. But if you don't have a really good sense of your organization, your product, your service, etc., very quickly you can have made a mistake. But I'll continue on. So a good test is whether a given report actually leads to a decision being made. If not, managers should question whether the report should be produced at all. And I will say, as a second point, I have experienced in my career reports that were just being generated for the sake of a report, that were very, really rarely, if at all, even looked at. Really just put an extra time burden on the employee, but didn't actually get used. And that's not to say that the report shouldn't have been done. It's just it wasn't being used effectively. It was more of a to-do checklist item and less of a activity of value. But it had the potential to have value. So definitely worth questioning. If you're getting a report, should you still be having this report produced? Are you using it to the best of what it can do for you? Should you maybe stop that report? Anyway, I'll keep reading. Other examples of ineffectiveness are the ritual meetings that fill many managers' calendars. So this book is at least 17 years old, and this is still absolutely a relevant problem in at least the industries I've been in. So I'll read it again. Other examples of ineffectiveness are the ritual meetings that fill many managers' calendars. Often, someone will attend a meeting solely to be able to communicate the results to those who do not attend, or worse, to provide nominal representation from a constituent body. Again, the test is whether everyone attending a particular meeting can either contribute necessary information or be helpful in arriving at the collective decision that is the purpose of the meeting. It is the effective manager's challenge to use meetings when they are appropriate, but to avoid them when they do not serve a demonstrable purpose, and to limit attendance to those who have a real reason for being there. So before we go on, I'll read the definitions of efficiency and effectiveness for the content we just read. Efficiency, the ability to achieve business objectives with the minimum of effort, expense, or waste. Effectiveness, doing the right thing at the right time to achieve the right results. Big fan of that one. And then there's just a quote. Managers must adapt to an unprecedented rate of change. One example of rapid change is that the laptop computer is many more times powerful than the room-sized computer that was state-of-the-art a few years ago. Or, because this book's a bit old, decades ago is more accurate. Anecdotally, I'll add that when it was talking about who you should have at a meeting, who you shouldn't have at a meeting, one of the questions that I think should be added on here is who's going to, it's not just about who can give the right info. Sometimes there's going to be people you work with who basically need you to completely re-describe to them what happened in the meeting. Which is hugely inefficient as the person attending, hosting, leading the meeting, participating, etc. And you can offset some of that with meeting minutes, very detailed meeting minutes, and sometimes that'll be sufficient. But if you find that you have a person in a position maybe more senior to you, where you'll do all this work, you'll get to these decisions, and on a consistent basis, you get to the end and they're not happy, even though you kept them in a loop all the way along, you might want to consider that person as somebody who, even though they might not appear to need to be a contributor, you're going to save some time for yourself by trying to engage them all the way along. And those are the people that I would call the sneaky micromanagers. All right. They're the ones who act like they don't need to be involved in a decision maker in everything. And they're the same tornadoes that will come in and completely undo a project after you've spent months working on it, even though you've kept them in the loop and got their buy-in the whole time. So I think that there's some real value in, if I were to choose between, and sometimes email is better, but if I were to be making a decision, designing something, strategizing, etc., if I was at a critical point before I was about to go do a whole bunch of work to support that decision, I would want to make sure that the people above who are going to be telling me yay or nay are on that call, to hear the rationale, to hear everybody else's rationale, to hear how we got there, to give them their opportunity to ask their questions, because there is nothing more frustrating than doing months of work on something and having to start back at A, not because you missed something, but because of someone's preference that they have decided to come to after not being involved. I also highly recommend very good meeting minutes for the meetings that you do, and CCing the appropriate stakeholders as well. Because sometimes you just can't get people at the meetings that you need. It can be very helpful. And on a more positive note, the people that have attended the meetings where I've done really good detailed meeting minutes, they appreciate it, because then week over week, when we're starting our next conversation, we're able to look where we left off, what decisions we made, what decisions we still need to make, what action items were left, what action items are still left. So it really just keeps it to being one continuous productive meeting, as opposed to, I've been in some meetings where they're not met with meeting minutes, and they're not as well managed, where you end up having pretty much the exact same conversation week over week over week, because everybody's so busy and they're just jumping from one meeting to the next, and you've basically got to get everybody caught up again the next time. So there's some real value in having the right people at the meeting. There's also some real value in some great meeting minutes afterwards, with clear, tangible decisions that were made and clear and tangible action items with owners assigned. So I know that's not part of this section, but I really wanted to add value where I can when I'm reading this, and hopefully that's helpful for you. So we'll move on to the next section of this chapter 1, which is called Special Features of Management in Small Business. Some multinational corporations have larger annual revenues than the gross domestic product of a number of small countries. And it says see Exhibit 1. So I flipped over to Exhibit 1.1, and it gives an example of 20 companies at that time that were with largest revenues, and 20 representative countries with lower gross domestic product, 6 billion. So one of the examples that I think is kind of interesting is Walmart. So Walmart is an American, at the time was listed as a US nationality company. Revenues of 83.4. I think this is maybe billion. Let's say. I think it's billion. Yes, it's billion. And Israel as a country is 69.4 billion. I'm curious what that would be in today's times, but that was an interesting one. And these were from a statistical yearbook from 1995. So that's how outdated that particular stat is, but yeah. So I'll read again. Some multinational corporations have larger annual revenues than the gross domestic product of a number of small countries. It is tempting to think of management in terms of these huge companies. Nevertheless, as has been said, the fundamental principles do not depend on size. So even a small business must address the same aspects of management. In the small business, one or a few individuals must provide or find ways of providing expertise in all of the different areas that specialists provide in a large corporation. Although there are compensating factors, this difference poses a major challenge for the managers of small business. Further discussion of this management challenge appears in chapter 13. So the next heading I'm actually looking forward to reading. I've been enjoying this, I don't mean that, but it's called Characteristics of Successful Managers. So let's see how much of this I agree with. I probably do. A study by Partridge House, a consulting firm, identified 10 behavioral characteristics of a successful manager, regardless of age, sex, industry, organization, size, or corporate culture. Those characteristic behaviors are: provides clear direction. Oh, I like that one. And it describes that as: an effective manager needs to involve people in establishing explicit goals and standards for groups, as well as for individuals, and must be clear and thorough in delegating responsibility. And the second is encourages open communication. Managers must be candid, honest, and direct in dealing with people, establishing a climate of openness and trust. That one is very important and very, I think it's a very difficult one for people to really consistently be able to do. I think there's a lot of dynamics usually at play, especially in the size of, depending on the size of the corporation. But I do think that a manager who leads by example in this regard is going to be the most successful at encouraging open communication. So I'll read again: managers must be candid, honest, and direct in dealing with people, establishing, because it will help establish a climate of openness and trust. Coaches and supports people. Managers must work constructively to correct performance problems and go to bat with superiors for subordinates. In brackets, it says, the latter was consistently rated as one of the most important aspects of effective leadership, says Robert Stringer, Senior VP of Partridge House. I wholeheartedly agree with this one as well. More often, I have not, I wish more managers in my career actually went to bat for their subordinates. I think it's very easy for them to just pass the buck down to the subordinates, whether the subordinate caused it or not. And if the subordinate did cause it, just reprimand them without context or support. And there's many times where the subordinate's done a really good job, and I think if a manager is willing to go to bat for you, it means a lot. I can think of examples of times where I was asked to do something. I did it exactly how I was asked to do it by my by people that managed me. And then when there was backlash because maybe the person on the receiving end of my action pulled higher rank than me and or the person instructing me, I was for sure the scapegoat, for sure. But I can think of a different example when I was working at a bank in a branch, and we had these rules around check cashing. And there were certain things that had to be met to cash a check. And there were certain things that you did not cash that check. If they wanted to give it to you, you had to hold it for a certain period of time, or it had to be put towards certain things that were owed. So without getting into those details, I was always very thorough. And if I went to my manager and asked for an exception, I'd bring my proof that I needed to bring, et cetera, et cetera. And I guess I thought the example I was going to give you was that they had my back, but in a way they did, in a way they didn't. The manager came out to the client, who was very upset because they wanted their money, understandably, and gave the exception, but didn't take that opportunity to showcase that I had actually been doing exactly what I was supposed to do. Something like, Stephanie was doing everything she should have done. She came to me advocating on your behalf. Since she has advocated on your behalf and it makes sense, I'm going to use my authority to override this rule as an exception. but I want you to know she did everything right. To me, that's an example in a client-facing scenario where the client's still getting what they need. The employee's done everything right, so they're not feeling like they're getting, kicked for doing their job. And the manager is saying, I've helped you and I've got my employees back. So I think that's a really helpful example that I wish more managers would do, in a variation of situations where it was, they were doing everything right. This is exactly what we asked them to do. It's because they advocated for you that we're about to do something different, but that is outside of process. So yeah, I think someone who coaches and supports and goes to bat for their employee, that means a lot. And it makes a safer space, right, for you to do your job and to do it well and to do it right. The fourth says provides objective recognition. So I'll be interested to hear what they say about this. Managers must recognize employees for good performance more often than they criticize them for problems, with rewards being related to the quality of job performance rather than to seniority or personal relationships. So I'm trying not to laugh here because this is very true. This is very good advice. And this is very often not the case. So I'll read it again. Managers must recognize employees for good performance more often than they criticize them for problems, with rewards being related to the quality of job performance rather than to seniority or personal relationships. So there was something in my industry called a shit sandwich. So basically when they somehow thought that by giving you a compliment, then supposedly a constructive feedback thing, and then another compliment at the end, that it would soften the blow. Depending on how it's done, that can be helpful, but it kind of depends on the significance of the criticism, right? And it depends on what you're trying to get at them. So if somebody had made a mistake, starting with, I can tell you're always trying your really best. You're a really good employee. I love your positive attitude, et cetera, et cetera. And I really want to, groom you to be a exceptional employee here. And I really think you have that potential. And here's what I'm noticing. And here's my suggestion on how you fix it. And overall, you're doing great. Keep doing what you're doing. Really appreciate you. Something like that. I think that's probably a good example of a potentially positive shit sandwich. But it really depends on the sincerity of the positives around it. And I just think overall, I think unfortunately, more time is given in a business environment talking about what they're not happy about than what they are happy about, and that what they are happy about they take for granted. So even if an employer is very happy with you, and a manager, etc., I think really taking that time as a manager on a regular basis, and not just when something blows up, goes wrong, and just saying what they're doing good, even if there's no bad to say, just, oh, that was a really great shift. You did a really good job, or that was a great sale, or, that was such a good customer experience, or you should have heard the reviews I heard about you. They were so positive. I think those, rather than the shit sandwich, but on a regular basis, those positives that you're seeing, really just nurturing them and vocalizing them on a regular basis already kind of creates that feeling of safety in the workplace. So that when you do need to come back and say, hey, something's up, it's not like that's your primary conversation with them. It's the anomaly. Yeah. So I've got lots more I can say about that, but I'll keep reading. We'll see what it says. So this next section is called Management in the Real World. So let's see if this stays current. Probably does. The Management Challenge, Quality and Competitiveness, Reflections by Philip Crosby. Getting an organization to do things right the first time is obviously a good idea. Naturally, it's cheapest to do something only once. Along those lines, it seems apparent that happy customers are a company's primary objective. Yet the conventional way of managing isn't automatically tilted towards these objectives. Management is full of old wives' tales, ideas that are accepted as true without investigation. Management has its own agenda, which is usually very short-term oriented. Executives used to tell me that I would bankrupt the company if I insisted on getting everything perfect. They had a vision of work slowing to a crawl while each step was inspected and tested several times. They talked about the perils of babying the customer. They wanted to grant permission to deliver materials and services that weren't absolutely correct, merely fit to be used. People who talk about the good old days when everything was done better have selective memories. Nothing was made right the first time years ago. It was reworked until it was acceptable, which was part of the plan. Management knew in its heart that the problem was the workers, so they kept making systems to reduce labor's effect. This discouraged people and led to a self-fulfilling prophecy of even more separation of the workforce from product and service quality. I found myself trying to explain the people to the management and vice versa. One day, when I was a quality engineer, I was asked to attend the monthly management review and say a few words about quality. I put on my good suit and appeared at the proper time, sitting in the back of the room. The meeting began with comptroller breaking down revenue by product line and service. There was an animated discussion about each item, particularly those not meeting the objectives. Charts and discussions on profitability, inventory, employee compensation, purchasing, accounts receivable, and debt followed for 3 hours. Sounds like a terrible meeting. Then the personnel director presented a new hospitalization plan. Next, the industrial relations director talked about labor negotiations and the possibility of a strike. Then there was a pause. The general manager checked his watch and noted that they had invited Phil Crosby to come and talk about quality. "We've used up most of the time, Phil," he said. "Could you limit your remarks to 5 minutes or so?" I noticed that the attendees were busily putting their papers away and checking things out with each other. This wasn't going to be an attentive group, I thought, but I nodded and stood up. When they quieted down, I smiled and said, "Quality can be measured by money also. If we added up the expense of doing things wrong and over, like rework, customer service inspection, excess inventory, unplanned overtime, accounts receivable, overdue, engineering change notices, purchasing change notices, and such, it comes to over 20% of revenue. These are my figures put together without benefit of the accounting department, but I think if they're calculated properly, the number will be much higher. Roughly, the price of non-conformance, as I call it, is 5 times the pre-tax profit I saw reported earlier. Thank you." When I sat down, the group just stared at me. The general manager turned to the controller. 5 times pre-tax profits, he asked. "Anyway," said the comptroller, "I've mentioned it before." The meeting continued for another hour and ended with the price of non-conformance becoming a regular part of the accounting and reporting process. From that moment on, management's interest in quality was focused. The old beliefs disappeared and were replaced by management's attention on a management subject. They reduced the price of non-conformance expense by half in just a year just by changing their attitude and attacking problems that measurement showed to be important. They even started talking to their employees. Measure quality by money, not by statistics. Be real. Oh, and the characteristics of successful managers actually had 10 points. So my apologies, I just read the first 4. So I'll reread the 4th one because it carried over to the next page. Provides objective recognition. Managers must recognize employees for good performance more often than they criticize them for problems, with rewards being related to the quality of job performance rather than to seniority or personal relationships. Most managers don't realize how much criticism they give. The study says they do it to be helpful, but positive recognition is what really motivates people. So I didn't need to say my little bit because it covers it here. Number 5, establishes ongoing controls. This means following up on important issues and actions and giving subordinates feedback on their individual and collective performance. Number 6, selects the right people to staff the organization. Managers must attract and select the best people in terms of skills and competencies to accomplish the organization's missions and goals. Number 7, understands the financial implications of decisions. This quality is considered important even for managers of support departments, such as personnel, human resources, and research and development, whose connection to the organization's profit margin is only indirect, albeit just as important as that of the primary operating departments. Number 8, encourages innovation and new ideas. Employees rate this quality important in even the most traditional and conservative organizations. Number 9, gives subordinates clear-cut decisions when they're needed. Employees want a say in things, the report says, but they don't want endless debate. There's a time to get on with things, and the best managers know when that time comes. Number 10, consistently demonstrates a high level of integrity. I value this one a lot. The study shows that most employees want to work for a manager they can respect. Very true. Many of these attributes reflect the application of basic communication and human relationship principles. Others reflect analytical and conceptual thinking. Still, others require the courage to make decisions when decisions must be made. All depend on the practice of time management techniques, for time is the one resource that cannot be stretched, so its effective use is paramount. These skills and techniques are not innate, that is, no one is born with them, but they can be learned. So there's a real world reflection, and it's called encouraging self-responsibility. Self-responsibility means that employees take 100% of the responsibility for their work. Gerald Kushel, author of Reaching the Peak Performance Zone, says, self-responsibility means simply that you decide how good you want to be, how hard you want to work, how thoroughly you want to do something, how far you want to go. Not your boss, not the shop steward, not your colleagues, not the president of the company. And when things don't work out as you planned, you take responsibility for your mistakes and setbacks. Employees may enjoy having a bigger piece of the action because they are trusted with a higher level of decision-making. Their problem-solving ideas are solicited and implemented more regularly. An end result hopefully will lead to employees believing that their work is valuable and important. An intangible benefit is the individual taking pride in performing at a new level of excellence. And the management strategy. All of the individuals working for you are unique. Each person is going to respond differently to the question, what's in it for me? So our next section is called Levels of Management. And I'll give you a definition first. Managers. Top-level managers are responsible for developing long-range plans for the business. Middle managers are responsible to top-level managers for directing and managing one or more business units or functions. First-line managers are responsible to middle managers for direct supervision of the performance of non-management employees. All managers perform, so that's the end of the definition. So back to levels of management. All managers perform the four basic functions of management: planning, organizing, leading, and controlling. Each manager's job, however, reflects different proportions of these basic areas of responsibility, depending on such factors as the manager's level in the organization, the kind of business, industry, or organization, the culture of the organization, and even the personal skills and interests of the manager. For convenience, those who study management and those who actually practice it usually divide the levels of management on the basis of their vertical rank in the organization. These categories are top management, middle management, and first-line management. Top management. As might be expected from the term, top management refers to the most senior officers of the organization. In a large corporation, this may include several vice presidents, the president, and a chairman, and a chief executive officer. Bombardier Inc., one of Canada's largest companies, provides an example with a slight variation. In 1995, Bombardier had a chairman and CEO, a president and chief operating officer, an executive vice president, and 7 vice presidents. The task of this company's top management structure is to guide and direct a Canadian corporation whose 40,000 employees are engaged in worldwide operations that generate more than $7 billion in revenues. By contrast, in a relatively small business, which might have 15 or 20 employees and only $1 of revenues for every 10,000 of Bombardiers, the top management typically might consist of the owner or owners and perhaps 1 or 2 heads of divisions, such as sales and production. The behavior and attitudes of top management set the tone for the whole enterprise, regardless of its size. In the small business, the top manager's leadership has a direct impact on nearly every employee. In a large corporation, on the other hand, the direct impact of top management leadership is often largely restricted to the contacts with other top managers and with the people in the upper levels of middle management. They in turn convey the patterns of behavior and attitudes to those with whom they have most contact, and so on down the hierarchical structure of the organization. Middle management. People at the middle management level typically have one of 2 main roles. One is to manage a particular operation of the business, such as mine, factory, retail outlet, or region of operations. The other is to manage a specific support function, such as accounting, purchasing, or human resource management. Typical position titles are department manager, area sales manager, plant manager, director of procurement, or human resources manager. In a small organization, one individual may fulfill several of these roles. Middle managers are accountable to top managers or to other middle managers, and often must coordinate their work with that of other middle managers. Competitive pressures have caused many organizations to downsize their management cadres, especially at the middle management level. In the past 10 years, many middle management positions have been eliminated in companies such as Comico, Nortel, and Canadian Pacific. I don't think Nortel's around anymore, are they? Nah, anyway, we'll see. Competitive pressures indicate that the shrinking of management in large companies likely will continue throughout the foreseeable future. As these middle management positions disappear, top managers either have to take on the computers and what they can do. Just see here. I skipped a page. That makes more sense. As these middle management positions disappear, top managers either have to take on the functions formerly performed by the middle managers or have to permit some tasks to be left undone. First line management. Managers classified as, and actually I'll say something here. So permitting some tasks to be left undone. I think often what'll happen when there's a bit of a squish from a staffing perspective is it'll just get pushed down the chain. Doesn't mean it's feasible for the person receiving the additional ask, right? So I think that's an important point, that it's actually permitting some tasks to be left undone as opposed to just finding somebody else to do it, with, doing the exact same amount or more with less people. There should be some considerations around that, some more considerations. First line management. Managers classified as first line coordinate the work of others who aren't themselves managers. They work much closer than top or middle managers to the people who actually produce the product or provide the services for which the organization exists. First line managers may have titles such as supervisor, office manager, or foreman, a title that seems to persist even when the foreman is a woman. In small organizations, the first line manager may be accountable directly to top managers or managers. In a larger organization, accountability probably will be to a middle manager. In either situation, the first line manager probably will oversee the work of skilled or unskilled workers, salespeople, accounting clerks, or scientists, depending on this subunit's particular tasks. In these examples, production, marketing, accounting, or research. First line managers are responsible for the organization's basic work and are in daily or nearly daily contact with the staff members accountable to them. They must work their own staff. No, they must work with their own staff and with other first line supervisors whose tasks are related to their own. Mix of responsibilities. The extent to which a manager is involved in each of the 4 basic areas of management is dictated in part by the manager's position in the hierarchy of an organization. In one study, reported more than a decade ago, but doubtless still representatives of the situation today, managers were asked what activities were most important in their jobs. From their responses, it is clear that as an individual is promoted up the organizational ladder, planning takes on more and more importance in that person's workload, while less time and energy are devoted to organizing and controlling. The extent of involvement in direct leadership varies considerably from individual to individual. Exhibit 1-2 illustrates a typical mix of activities at each of the 3 levels. I'll try and show it to you. There we go. I'm not really sure that one's as helpful. One of the things it's showing is that computer skills remain equally required all the way up. Conceptual skills become more necessary the higher you get up in management. Same with decision making. Analytical skills remain similar, but get a little bit more significant the higher you get up in management. Human relation skills, similar, but actually gets to be a little bit less as you get to the top management. Not sure I agree with that. Communication skills, that remains a constant, and technical skills seem to get less as you go higher up, and that's probably just because you have support people that can do those parts and be the experts on those parts. So rather than just showing it to you, I just kind of explain to you what the visual shows. So our next our next section is called managerial skills. These chapters are kind of long. So managerial skills. To start off, I'll give you some definitions. The first one is skill. Ability or proficiency in performing a particular task or kind of task. Conceptual skill. the ability to think in abstract terms, to analyze and diagnose problems, and to make use of lateral thinking when appropriate. Analytical skills, the ability to solve problems by applying basic principles in a logical manner. Regardless of the level at which managers perform, they must learn and develop many skills. Conceptual skill. This skill consists of the ability to see the big picture, as well as the complexities of the overall organization. To keep an organization focused, managers must conceptualize how each part of the organization fits and how those parts interact with each other to accomplish goals and operate in an ever-changing environment. Analytical skill. This skill involves solving management problems by applying logic to relevant information and reaching a conclusion. It requires the ability to identify key factors to understand how they interrelate and to apply them in a given situation. Long-range planning requires a combination of both conceptual and analytical skills to look forward and project how prospective actions may affect an organization 5, 10, or even 20 years into the future. Although events will not turn out exactly as planned, the long-range vision helps the company to plot its present courses of action in such a way as to provide the flexibility required to meet changing conditions and remain competitive. And I would argue that I'm not sure that every business does do planning that far out anymore. I do think that there has been a strong shift to focusing on the quick wins. And I think that's kind of a side effect of all the talent jumping between various organizations. Whereas in my parents' generation, you would have found a company, stayed there, worked there your whole life. So maybe you would have been more focused on the real long term when completing your part of a job. But I'm just not sure that that's the focus, even up to the executive level in some organizations, because they might not be planning on being at that organization longer than a few years either, right? So although I think there's a lot of value in doing planning out all that way to the 5, 10, and 20-year mark, I'm just not sure it happens as much as it should. So before I keep reading, I'm going to give you a couple more definitions that have came up. Decision-making skill, the ability to choose solutions from alternatives, and to have the courage to take definitive action when required. People skill, the ability to work effectively with and motivate others. Communication skill, the ability to listen actively and to transmit to others ideas, concepts, and directions. Computer skill, having sufficient understanding of how computers can facilitate decision-making in order to be able to make effective selection and use of hardware and software. Technical skill, the ability to apply specific knowledge, technique, or expertise to perform a task. So, decision-making skill. All managers must make decisions by choosing from alternatives. The quality of these decisions determines the manager's effectiveness. In addition to skill in decision-making, managers have to develop the courage to actually make decisions. This may be more difficult than it seems because the manager knows that any change might lead to unforeseen outcomes, and it often seems safer to postpone making a definitive decision or to avoid making it altogether. Effective managers realize, however, that not making a decision is actually making a decision to continue with the status quo, whatever it may be. People skill. Since all managers must accomplish much of their work through other people, it is vital that they work effectively with those other people, both inside and outside of the organization. One aspect of people skill is effective communication. the written and oral transmission of information, instructions, criticism or praise, and a genuine indication of interest in the other person as an individual. Communication skill. The ability to communicate accurately and concisely is critical to success in every field, but it is perhaps even more important for managers than for non-managers. This skill involves the ability to convey ideas and messages in ways that other people understand and to seek and use feedback from employees to ensure that the messages have been understood. This subject is discussed further in Chapter 10. Louis Lair, Chairman and CEO of 3M, demonstrates one form of effective people and communication skills. He spends 6 months of every year away from 3M headquarters, visiting the company's numerous plants in several countries. Then he participates in question and answer sessions with the employees, building the employee trust and cooperation that are essential to 3M's success. Lair also requires the other 3M executives to visit frequently with representatives of the media, government, and education to talk about 3M. Computer skill. In a study of 100 personnel directors from some of North America's largest corporations, 7 of every 10 directors reported that they classified computer skills as important, very important, or essential for advancement in management. This does not mean that managers must be able to write computer programs or even have a high degree of competence in operating a computer, although the latter is becoming increasingly useful. That's where it's outdated because now it's completely necessary for almost every job. Instead, middle managers are required to have enough knowledge of computers and what they can do, to oversee the selection and application of computer hardware and software, and to ensure that computer-generated reports are as effective as possible in facilitating management decision-making. Technical skill. This skill reflects the ability to use specific knowledge, techniques, and resources in performing work. Accounting supervisors, engineering directors, and nursing supervisors, for instance, all need highly specific technical skills to perform their management jobs. Technical skills are especially important at the first line management level, since daily work-related problems must be solved. Middle managers need to marshal sufficient technical skills to be able to monitor the work of supervisors and of those they supervise, and to offer guidance when serious problems arise. But they do not need complete technical mastery of all the skills that are required in the areas for which they are responsible. Top managers, similarly, need enough technical skill to understand operations and to distinguish between technical competence and incompetence in their subordinates. Top managers, however, need not be, nor could they be, technically competent in all of the areas of knowledge required throughout a large organization. It is not a coincidence that technical skill is the last one to be identified in this list of managerial skills. It is widely recognized that when a manager fails, it is seldom caused by a lack of technical skills, but rather by a lack of other managerial skills. Skills required by managers at various levels. While the preceding skills are all important, just as with the functions of management, the importance of each kind of skill varies with the level of the manager in the organization. Exhibit 1.2 that I previously showed you illustrates the skills required at each level. For example, technical and human relations skills are usually highly important at lower levels of management. These managers have greater contact with the actual production of product or delivery of service and with the people doing these tasks. Communication and computer skills are equally important at all levels of management. Analytical skills are slightly more important at higher levels of management, where the environments are less stable and problems are less predictable. Finally, decision-making and conceptual skills are extremely critical to top managers. Performance. Top management's primary responsibility is to make decisions that are implemented at lower levels and to foster a climate throughout the organization that enhances its ability to meet its goals. So there's a quote here, and it says, "Managing a construction project requires the application of all kinds of skills: conceptual, analytical, decision-making, people, communication, and technical. Detailed plans help to focus how these skills are applied, but are not substitutes for them. And then there's a new section before we move on, and it says what managers are reading. And the title of the article is called The Witch Doctors, Making Sense of the Management Gurus. So many management fads and theories have surfaced within the past century that one could say that Frederick W. Taylor opened a floodgate. John Micklethwaite and Adrian Wooldridge have observed this deluge from their vantage points as business editor and managing editor, respectively, of The Economist. From this book, it would seem that their observation has ranged from amused toleration to outright disdain. In this well-written volume, they attempt to sort through some of the most important of the current and recently discarded management fads, and to make sense out of them as a whole without espousing any one as the final answer. They skillfully avoid succumbing to what must have been a strong temptation to skewer some of the more assertive and now discredited of the management gurus. Instead, they calmly express rather pointed opinions as to which theories have made significant contributions to management understanding and which have proven to be at best damp squibs and at worst the cause of management disasters. For instance, they rush in where proverbial angels fear to tread by taking a few shots at best-selling Tom Peters, whom they dub the middle manager's pinup. They award plaudits to true innovators such as Canada's Henry Mintzberg, some of whose works are briefly reviewed elsewhere in this text. They mercifully do not assign any ranking order to those whose works they believe might better have been left unpublished. In one of the more cogent passages, the authors attribute the plethora of management books and their amazing popularity to two human emotions, fear and greed. In their view, many managers fear that they will be left behind if they do not know about, and indeed often appear to put into practice, the latest management fads. They also say that many managers expect miraculous bottom line results if they can only latch on to the latest in the management theories, or at least the latest versions of management theories that may have been known for many years. The authors do not promise that those who buy their book will have a transformation in their thinking or actions. Instead, a major theme is to warn that no books will accomplish this sought-after answer to all management problems. And that warning in itself may be the greatest value in the book, which has received favorable reviews all over North America and topped several bestseller lists for many weeks. So this is a section of the textbook that just talks about books that other managers are reading right now. This would have been set back in the article they're talking about was written in 1998 from the looks of the source. And then we move on to roles played by managers. And there's a couple definitions before we start. So role, a behavior pattern expected of or exhibited by an individual in a given situation. Managerial role, the behavior pattern of a manager incorporating interpersonal, informational, and decisional roles. A role is the behavior pattern exhibited by an individual or that is expected of an individual within a unit or position. One of the most frequently cited studies of managerial roles was conducted by Henry Mintzberg, a Canadian who published what has become recognized worldwide as a classic management source. So again, that's Henry Mintzberg. He interviewed and observed 5 chief executives from different industries, each for a 2-week period. He determined that managers serve in 10 different but closely related activities. Exhibit 1.3 on page 17 summarizes some of his findings. So Mintzberg's 10 managerial roles, and there's three circles, and they kind of flow together. I'll show you it. So I'll read you what's in each of these boxes since it's going backwards for you. Interpersonal roles: figurehead, leader, liaison. And that's the top. And the other two circles feed up to the top and pass to the, anyway. Informational roles: monitor, disseminator, spokesperson. Decisional roles: entrepreneur, disturbance handler, resource allocator, negotiator. So the informational roles feed to the decisional roles and the interpersonal roles. The decisional roles feed to the interpersonal roles, but the interpersonal roles don't appear to feed down to the informational or decisional, in the visual at least. Mintzberg categorizes these 10 activities into 3 broadly described groups of roles: interpersonal roles, informational roles, and decisional roles. Interpersonal roles. So that was the yellow circle. The 3 interpersonal roles of figurehead, leader, and liaison grow out of the manager's formal authority and focus on interpersonal relationships. By assuming these roles, the manager can also perform informational roles that in turn lead directly to performing decisional roles. I'll read that again. By assuming these roles, the manager also can perform informational roles that in turn lead directly to performing decisional roles. All managerial jobs require some duties that are symbolic or ceremonial in nature. Examples of the figurehead role include that of the college dean who reads the names of students at graduation, the manager who makes an appearance at the wedding of a subordinate's daughter, although I don't know if that's common in big companies, and the CEO whose name appears on the letterhead of a charitable organization in an honorary capacity. The manager's leadership role involves directing and coordinating the activities of subordinates. One part of this role is to lead by personal example. Another part probably involves staffing, hiring, training, promoting, disciplining, and dismissing, and motivating employees. The leadership role also involves controlling or making sure that things are going according to plan. Chapter 6 explores a number of aspects of the leadership role. The liaison role involves managers in interpersonal relationships outside their area of command, both inside and outside of the organization. Within the organization, managers must interact with numerous other managers and other individuals. Many managers must maintain relationships with customers or officers of customer corporations, with officials of governmental agencies, and in some cases, with representatives of the media. So that was all talking about interpersonal roles, the yellow circle. So now we're going on to informational roles, which was the blue circle, which feeds to both informational and decisional. As a result of the 3 interpersonal roles just discussed, managers develop informational networks or interpersonal contacts. As a result of these contacts, the managers gather and receive information and transmit it both upwards and downwards in the hierarchy. In this activity, the manager is acting in an informational role. One of the perplexities of management is that the higher one goes within a hierarchy, the less contact one has with the majority of the staff in the organization, and the greater is the tendency of others to shield the manager from bad news. As a consequence of these 2 factors, an important goal of any manager wishing to perform effectively is to transcend these restrictions and to enhance the free flow of information. The monitor role involves observing the internal and external environments to discover information, changes, opportunities, and problems that may affect the unit. The information gathered may concern competitive moves that could influence the entire organization, such as observing young people wearing a new fashion that suggests a change in a product line, or noting changes in the rejection rate of items being produced. The disseminator role involves providing important information to subordinates and to peers. It may be done formally in writing or in a meeting, but more often, information is disseminated informally. In the spokesperson role, the manager represents the unit to other people. This representation may be internal, such as when a manager makes a case for salary increases to top management. Equally important, the manager represents and speaks for top management in explaining company policy to the people in the manager's unit. The spokesperson role also may be external, such as when executives speak to a local civic organization or to representatives of a governmental agency or the news media. And then our third circle within Mintzberg's 10 managerial roles is decisional roles. And it goes on to say, developing interpersonal relationships and gathering information are important, but they aren't ends in themselves. They serve as the basic inputs to the process of decision making. Some people believe that decisional roles as entrepreneur, disturbance handler, resource allocator, and negotiator are a manager's most important roles, but only some people. The entrepreneurial role's purpose is to improve performance and effectiveness by innovative means. Entrepreneurial behavior is discussed in chapter 13. In the disturbance handler role, managers make decisions or take corrective action in response to pressures and conflicts that arise either internally or externally. When an emergency room supervisor responds quickly to a local disaster, a plant manager reacts to a strike, or a first line manager responds to a breakdown in a key piece of equipment, or to a conflict between members of the staff. They are dealing with disturbances in their environments. Because these situations require a prompt response, often the disturbance handler role temporarily takes priority over all other roles. In the resource allocator role, a manager decides who will get what resources, whether it be money, people, time, materials, and equipment. Invariably, there aren't enough resources to go around, so the manager must allocate scarce goods among competing requests. Top managers must decide which departments and activities will receive more or less resources, thus determining which will expand or contract. These allocations set the course for the whole organization. A first-line supervisor must decide whether to set up overtime schedules or to hire part-time workers. Any manager responsible for several tasks or projects must decide daily how much time to spend on each, thus allocating the precious resource of time. In the negotiator role, managers must bargain with other units concerning the allocation of staff and other resources, or anything else influencing the unit. A sales manager may negotiate to convince the production manager to amend a production schedule to complete a special order for a valuable customer. A first-line supervisor may negotiate for new work schedules for employees, while a top-level manager may negotiate with labor union representatives or government officials. Mintzberg suggests that recognition of these 10 roles helps to explain the job of managing and illustrates that all the roles are interrelated. This interrelationship is illustrated in Exhibit 1.4 and applies as well in a small business as in the largest of organizations, and not only in businesses organized for profit, but also in not-for-profit and and applies as well in a small business as in the largest of organizations, and not only in businesses organized for profit, but also in not-for-profit and governmental agencies and bodies. And the visual that they're talking about says the interrelationship of skills, roles, and functions of management. And so it says, working from the top down, managers, so it shows 3 people, use, and then it has a pie, analytical, conceptual, technical, decision-making people skills to fulfill roles, whether interpersonal as a figurehead, leader, liaison, Decisional, whether entrepreneur, disturbance handler, negotiator, resource allocator. Informational, disseminator, spokesperson, monitor, informational, in order to perform the functions of management, whether that be planning, organizing, leading, or controlling. And before we keep going, there's a real world reflection. And its topic is management skills. Most people can easily name a manager they have worked for who does not personify the picture of the effective manager. While most managers have a sense of their end result responsibilities, not all demonstrate the behaviors that will achieve these goals efficiently. There are many skills that, if mastered, create stepping stones from objectives to results. These skills include listening, questioning, giving and receiving feedback, planning, team building, coaching, delegating. These behavior-based skills are often referred to as soft skills. And I'll read them again. Listening, questioning, giving and receiving feedback, planning, team building, coaching, delegating. As you develop as a manager, you will find your own natural style of delivery. If you are an aspiring manager, you can begin your training now by mastering these skills in your personal life. And this was contributed by Marnie Wright, British Columbia Institute of Technology. Next section, the classical approaches to management. And I'll give you a couple definitions before we begin. Classical theories of management, the general category describing early studies of management. Scientific management, the theory that there is one best way to do any particular job, that it can be ascertained and taught to employees, and that workers are motivated primarily by money. Maybe. Time and motion studies, timing each aspect of a job to determine the actual physical movements that will allow it to be done most effectively. Classical organizational theory, bureaucracy. I'll read those when we get closer to those. The history of management as a practice goes back into the mists of antiquity. Whenever and wherever people attempted to work together to accomplish a common purpose, complex planning and coordination must have been required to design, shape, transport, and direct the stones at Stonehenge, or to construct the pyramids of the ancient Egyptians and of the Maya in Central America. Even in the simplest of prehistoric communities, some form of management has always been required. Otherwise, people could not have coordinated their efforts to avoid chaos and to overcome the hazards posed by the life-threatening environments in which they existed. Yet, even though management was being practiced, it was not recognized either as a distinct function or as an academic discipline until early in the 20th century. Frederick Taylor, 1856 to 1915, and scientific management. One of the earliest to recognize management as a discipline was Frederick Taylor. He has been called the father of scientific management because of the influence of his book, Principles of Scientific Management, published in 1911. Based on his experience as the chief engineer in a steel plant, he believed that management's primary objective should be to secure the maximum prosperity for both the employer and each employee. I like that sentence, so I'm going to read it again. He believed that management's primary objective should be to secure the maximum prosperity for both the employer and each employee. I actually have an example of this. So I did waitressing and bartending all through university and a little bit after as well. And I worked for one particular bar. And what didn't stand out till later on when I worked at different bars and restaurants was how thoughtful that management, the owners were. So when they created the price points for their drinks, they explained that they would never price a drink at $4.25, and their rationale, or sorry, at $4.75. And the rationale for that was that then people like myself would get a bad tip, because most people aren't going to break a bill to tip you. So you'd be getting a quarter every time. So they explained that anytime they made the pricing, they actually considered what would generate an appropriate amount of tip change, so that we as the bartenders could make a really good wage while we were in school. So very often the price point for the drink, and this is going to date me a little bit because this was a while back, would be $3.25 or $3.50. So you typically end up getting all the change from the $5, and you'd give them their bills. You'd give it all back to them, but often they'd leave you the change. So $1.75 off of a $3.25 drink, that's a pretty good tip percentage wise. That's amazing, and it adds up quickly. And even if the person takes back the loonie, it's still percentage wise getting 75 cents on a $3.25 drink. That's still 20% as well. So that was actually a real life example of a manager of owners I worked for at a bar, where they were very thoughtful. Whereas on the flip side, I worked at a different bar in Toronto, and it was very popular. It was super, super expensive. And I have never been so penny pinched as the employee. They used what was called a berg, and it's supposed to count every time you pour a shot, but they're inconsistent and ineffective. So what essentially happens is you go to pour your one shot for your client who's paid for it. It pours like a half of a shot or a third. The client can see they didn't get it, so you have to pour more, but it adds to account. And at the end, when you go to pay out your tab for what you sold, you have to pay for 2 shots at the company's client-facing price, whatever they were, when they'd only actually poured out half of a shot twice, and the clients only paid you for 1 shot because they only got 1 shot. So that particular place I only worked at for a month because one of my colleagues left owing the bar $200, obviously because of the berg, and it being that particular, whether the bergs can be good elsewhere, I don't know, but they were obviously defective where I was working. And that just seemed like an extreme level of greed. There's so much ability in those industries to make good money for the bar as well as the server who's helping make you that money. So it was just such a polar opposite to my experience at one of my first bartending jobs. And I think it's a good example to hammer home what Frederick Taylor was trying to say, which was, I'll say it again, he believed that management's primary objective should be to secure the maximum prosperity for both the employer and each employee. To achieve these 2 objectives, Taylor applied what he called management science, or an approach based on systemic observation and measurement of worker activities. Taylor concluded that there must be one best way to do every task, and that production would be increased if every worker were taught the best way and required to follow it. I have opinions about part of this. Taylor used a stopwatch and later a movie camera to do what are called time and motion studies. In order to encourage worker cooperation, Taylor advocated an incentive pay. An incentive pay system in which any worker who produced more than the predetermined quantity would be paid more than workers who merely fulfilled their quotas. That's interesting. For the sake of efficiency, Taylor advocated that jobs be broken down into simple repetitive tasks. And I can see this having value depending on what the job is. I think where it's a job where there's a certain amount of creativity, strategy, etc., this might not make as much sense, but I could definitely see that making sense for like a factory line job, potentially. So it goes on to say, for the sake of efficiency, Taylor advocated that jobs be broken down into simple repetitive tasks. Then each worker would be required to learn and practice what managers had decided was the best way to do each task, taking no longer than the prescribed time allotted for it. Not surprisingly, workers resisted his methods. First, they feared with some justification that if they produced too much, they would work themselves out of a job. Second, The rigid specialization meant that they quickly became bored with their jobs. Another weakness in Taylor's thesis was his assumption that money was the only way to motivate workers, a fallacy that will be discussed further in chapter 8. I'm sure I'll have a lot of opinions on chapter 8. In addition, Taylor has been accused of having misinterpreted or even having falsified some of his research data and of having plagiarized material written by a colleague. That's unfortunate. Despite these criticisms and the fact that in his day, Taylor's proposals met with little enthusiasm from practicing managers, the study of management owes a significant debt to him for having proclaimed the need to consider management as something that could and should be studied. And then there's a quote: "The father of scientific management, Frederick W. Taylor, inaugurated a revolution in thinking about management." And I'll pause there because there is a Management in the Real World article that comes up. And it's called The Evolution of Management, Reflections by Philip Crosby. So we've heard from him already before once. Soon after I gained employment as a quality technician back in 1952, the company sent me to quality control school. There I learned that each process had its own lifestyle and results based on the laws of probability. I also learned that we should assign acceptable quality levels to know how many good things would emerge from the process. But the people conducting the process weren't to be trusted. So all the output had to be examined carefully and protected from use if it was found to be wanting. Little work was done properly the first time, but this was attributed to humans' built-in error factor. All in all, error was inevitable, and it was up to the science of the quality control to protect the world. My education and military experience were in medicine, where the main effort was to keep people from getting sick. For this reason, vaccines had been developed to spare people smallpox, diphtheria, polio, and other disagreeable diseases. So all of this scientific determination that things could never be done right the first time on a regular basis didn't make sense to me. But my teachers and coworkers believed it all, and so were upset with my deductions. They would point to the statistics and results. Sure enough, the manufacturing operations were struggling to raise their quality to the AQLs designed, indicating that more charts and more control were necessary. However, I thought things should be the other way around. The human element was completely missing. These beliefs assumed that people were no damn good. And that was the end of it. I felt that the concepts of quality control and of quality assurance, which checks on quality control, were fatally flawed. I felt that the defect rates were self-fulfilling, caused by the concept rather than the process. Since I was on the absolute bottom of the organization chart, my concerns had little effect, except to generate some fatherly lectures from my superiors. But these only encouraged me, since they were offering advice, not hemlock. I felt that the main problem, actually don't know, one sec. So I actually looked up what hemlock is. I just Googled it, just to get context for what he was saying there. I was pretty sure I understood it, but it says hemlock is a plant, Conium macula, anyway, colloquially known as hemlock. Poison hemlock or wild hemlock is a highly poisonous biennial herbaceous flowering plant in the carrot family, native to Europe and North Africa. So when I reread that sentence, that it's very poisonous, but these only encouraged me since they were offering advice, not hemlock. I felt that the main problem was that quality was considered to be goodness and was therefore negotiable. I proposed that we define the word as meaning conformance to requirements. That way we could spend our time teaching and helping people to do their jobs right the first time, rather than just treating the wounded. As we learned, we could then improve new requirements. Requirements, I thought, originated when we determined what the customers needed and described the actions necessary to produce that. We weren't talking just about the shop workers here. Most of the expensive problems were caused by errors originating in the white collar and other service areas. A paper I wrote on these ideas met with a complete lack of support. The conventional wisdom of quality control couldn't accept it. A few years later, when I brought the idea of 0 defects as a performance standard, it was completely rejected, even though it worked. But ideas that deserve to live, live. And now we see that the concept of preventing has become a normal part of management lifestyle. Relationships with employees, suppliers, and customers are beginning to be a priority of management. The old, do a good job and you get to keep it style is gone. But there are those who still think doing things right the first time costs more. I disagree. I think doing things right the first time saves money and it's just the way to do it. Anyway. But there are still those who still think doing things right the first time costs more. We need to continually test the concepts put forth by business practitioners and philosophers. People who would become effective and prosper can't just accept whatever has been believed before. Personal success comes from applying an open mind to current attitudes. A large chest of unsound concepts is waiting to be challenged. After all, not too long ago, tomatoes were considered poisonous. I didn't know that. So we've talked about the classical approaches to management, starting with scientific management, and now we're going to classical organizational theory. Henry Fayol, 1841 to 1925, and classical organizational theory. Classical organizational theory, the management theory that is primarily focused on the organization, its functions, and how it should be organized for greatest efficiency. Another approach focused on the management of organizations as contrasted with Taylor's focus on the management of tasks. This classical organizational theory was directed primarily to large organizations, but most of the principles enunciated are equally applicable to small business enterprises. Among several authors taking this approach, Henry Fayol was one of the more influential. Fayol divided an organization's activities into 6 categories, which he said were essential and present in all organizations. They are technical, production, manufacturing, commercial, buying, selling, financial, security, protecting property and persons, accounting, and managerial, planning, organizing, commanding, coordinating, and controlling. Fayol proposed the 14 principles shown in Exhibit 1.5 on page 22. He suggested that a manager's experience and sense of proportion should guide the degree of application of any principle in each particular situation. So Exhibit 1.5, Fayol's 14 principles of management. 1, division of work. Specialization of labor is necessary for organizational success. 2, authority. The right to give orders must accompany responsibility. 3, discipline. Obedience and respect help an organization run smoothly. 4, unity of command. Each employee should receive orders from only one superior. That's actually really important. I've done some roles where you had multiple, a dotted reporting line and had multiple reporting managers, and it's really difficult, especially if they give you conflicting priorities, conflicting instructions, conflicting preferences on how you do your work, everything. So I definitely agree that where possible, an employee should receive orders from only one superior. That's helpful. Unity of direction. The efforts of everyone in the organization should be coordinated and focused in the same direction. Subordination of individual interests to the general interest. Resolving the tug of war between personal and organizational interests in favor of the organization is one of management's greatest difficulties. 7, remuneration. Employees should be paid fairly in accordance with their contribution. That's super difficult to prove, measure, etc., but I agree. Centralization. The relationship between centralization and decentralization is a matter of proportion. The optimum balance must be found for each organization. 9. Scalar chain. Subordinates should observe the formal chain of command unless expressly authorized by their respective superiors to communicate with each other. I think that one's pretty dangerous for a number of reasons. 10. Order. Both material things and people should be in their proper places. 11. Equity. Fairness that results from a combination of kindliness and justice will lead to devoted and loyal service. I'm going to read that one again. Equity. Fairness that results from a combination of kindliness and justice will lead to a devoted and loyal service. 12. Stability and tenure of personnel. People need time to learn their jobs. It should be obvious, but that's a big one. I think there's a lot of people that expect that you come into a job and you can instantly knock it out of the park. And, I think depending on the job, that might be possible, but with a lot of them, you're learning for a lot of the first 6 months. And then I think the ratio kind of shifts from predominantly learning while still putting through output to, getting more efficient and effective at your output and still learning, but maybe a lesser proportion of things are net new to you. I think that one's an important one to be said. Initiative, number 13. One of the greatest satisfactions is formulating and carrying out a plan. 14. Esprit de corps. Harmonious effort among individuals is the key to organizational success. That one is for sure easier said than done, but agreed, obviously. I also think for number 12, stability and tenure of personnel, people need to learn their jobs, time to learn their jobs. I also think that a lot of training has gone out the door for complex jobs. And I wish that there was a way that could be brought back in. Because I think that there's a lot of money spent in organizations in all the time that each net new person takes learning the exact same stuff they could have been taught by somebody in a week, but over the course of months, because it's been through trial and error. I think that the old adage of sink or swim has limited utility, depending on the role. So Fayolles, who proposed these 14 principles, he suggested a manager's experience and sense of proportion should guide the degree of application of any principle in each particular situation. And then we have Max Weber, 1864 to 1920, and bureaucracy. Born in Germany, Max Weber, pronounced Weber, was interested in the authority structures in organizations. He made a distinction between power, the ability to force people to obey, and authority, where orders are voluntarily obeyed by those receiving them. According to Weber, the first mode of exercising authority is based on the qualities of the leader. The second mode of exercising authority is through precedent and usage, that is, by virtue of the status the manager has acquired. So I'll read that part again. According to Weber, the first mode of exercising authority, i.e. rather than power, authority, is based on the qualities of the leader. The second mode of exercising authority is through precedent and usage, that is, by virtue of the status of the manager has acquired. Before we keep going, definition of bureaucracy. Bureaucracy, management of an organization by specialization of labor, a hierarchy of authority, specific selection and promotion criteria, and adherence to a rigid set of rules, also the people who manage an organization that follows this pattern. I'll read it again. Bureaucracy, management of an organization by specialization of labor, a hierarchy of authority, a specific selection and promotion criteria, and adherence to a rigid set of rules. Also, the people who manage an organization that follows this pattern. Weber believed that the bureaucratic organization is the dominant institution in society because it's the most efficient. As he used the term, bureaucracy refers to a management approach based on a formal organizational structure with set rules and regulations that relies on specialization of labor, an authority hierarchy, and rigid promotion and selection criteria. He considered bureaucracy inevitable, but cautioned that it was the iron cage within which humanity will be stifled and die. I agree. I'm going to read that again. He considered bureaucracy inevitable, but cautioned that it was the iron cage within which humanity will be stifled and die. While he was speaking of the Germany of his day, his recognition both that some bureaucracies is necessary and that it embodies hazards is still relevant today. Another of his contributions, which was almost revolutionary when he proposed it, was the concept of management as a career, instead of something into which someone might just happen to stumble. Contributions and limitations of the classical approaches. The greatest contribution of the classical approaches was that they identified management as a subject that, like law, medicine, and other occupations, should be practiced according to principles that managers can learn. In addition, many of the management techniques used today, such as time and motion analysis, work simplification, incentive wage systems, production scheduling, personnel testing, and budgeting, are derived from the classical approaches. One major criticism of the classical approaches is that the majority of their insights are too simplistic for today's complex organizations in a constantly changing world. The approaches were simplistic by today's standards, but they provided an invaluable start. And I think I'm going to pause there. We're about halfway through the chapter, so I'm going to pick this up later. And so this will just be part one. And hope you enjoyed reading along with me. If you do, like the video, put some comments down. If there's something you want to discuss in a group chat, let me know in the comments and I might coordinate a Zoom for us. And otherwise, I'll see you at page 22, the behavioral approaches to management when we come back. Still chapter 1 of Management in Canada, the Competitive Challenges. Thank you.